and gentlemen, for those of you who were not in the Hamlin Gallery, a very warm welcome to tonight's lecture. This is a very special occasion because it's the first real occasion we have celebrated on such a grand scale one of our wonderful alumni, Mary Renault, and we have just presented the prize to the outstanding school students, non-classic students, as part of our determined effort to ensure that the study of classics at this university has a very strong lifeblood and continues for many, many centuries to come. We're delighted to have it. It is the idea of Professor Tim Rood. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers who are with us tonight. We will now have a lecture from Paul Cartledge, who is the A.G. Leventis Senior Research Fellow at Clare College and Professor of Greek Culture Emeritus at the University of Cambridge. He's a specialist on ancient Greek history, particularly ancient Sparta. He is the author of more than a dozen books, most recently Democracy, A Life, which is currently Book of the Month at the Oxford University Press Bookshop. Hope I'm going to get a small commission for that.
Yeah, well, that's news to me.
It doesn't sound as if it requires it, having said that. He's also written more than 70 articles. He has made many television and radio appearances and is a well-kept face on media, notably on In Our Time. He's a holder of the Gold Cross of the Order of Honour, awarded by the President of Greece, and is an honorary citizen of Sparta.
Yeah, modern Sparta. Modern Sparta.
More importantly, he has had the good sense to marry a graduate of St. Hughes College. Judith Portrait. He is also the PhD, or was a PhD supervisor of Carol Attack, who has been a wonderful teacher here, and we hope to suck her back from Warwick very soon, back to Oxford University. Paul, it is our delight that you are able to deliver this lecture tonight, and I look forward to it. Paul's lecture will be followed by a discussion panel, and I'll introduce our speakers at that point.
Thank you very much. So first of all, can you hear me at the back, at that level of decibels? Terrific. Well, first of all, let me thank at least three people. First of all, the principal of St. Hughes, Dame Elish, who seems a considerably less formidable presence than the principal when I was a student in Oxford. That was Dame Kathleen Kenyon. KK. Thanks to Tim, the rude boy, for inviting me to give this talk, and thanks to Carol, who actually is responsible, so blame her for all the slides. The choice, the disposition, the representation, no, I'm only joking. She does the technical stuff, which I'm totally incompetent at. So this is, for me, a trip down memory lane, because as Dame Elish said, I am indeed married to an old girl, an alumna of St. Hughes. In fact, we lived, when we got married, just down the road on the junction of Woodstock Road and St. Margaret's Road in Hartley Court, and that's where we had our wedding reception. And we were very fortunate. The reason we met was that we shared a common tutor, C.E. Courtney Edward Tom Brown Stevens of Magdalen. And you may be wondering, I was at New College, Judy was at St. Hughes. What were we doing meeting at Magdalen? Well, the answer was that in those days, when you did greats, you did 1 year of Greek history, and there was an arrangement between New College and Magdalen, between Geoffrey de St. Croix and Tom Brown Stevens. Geoffrey did the Greek, so the Magdalen people came to New College. Robin Lane Fox is an exact contemporary of mine. Terry Irwin is an exact contemporary of mine. And for Roman history, we went to Magdalen. Tom summoned all his students for a preliminary meeting in just about this time of year, end of April 1968, just a few years ago. And strangely enough, Judy was the sole female pupil of Tom Brown Stevens. But I hasten to add, a lot of water flowed under many bridges between that moment when I was actually living with someone else, another female person elsewhere in Oxford. But nevertheless, after a few years, we got together. And in fact, my first Oxford girlfriend, as opposed to a girlfriend with whom I lived, was also a St. Hughes girl. So my connections with this college are extremely intimate, but they are also academic, I hasten to add. And they are for this reason, that one reason I stand before you with the sort of career I've had is that in our mods, second year I think it must have been, one term I chose to do the most extraordinarily named option, Homeric Archaeology, which meant that you read the whole of Homer, you looked in great detail at particular passages for material artifactual correlations. So in other words, at what point in the tradition might that artifact have been referred to by this poet and incorporated in the tradition? So it's thanks to her, really, I then went on and did an archaeological doctorate under John Boardman, now Sir John Boardman, and I believe he owes his title entirely to me. I might be wrong. Dear friend still, he's now 88, but I think he may be younger than one or two of you in this audience. I am extremely impressed by that. Anyhow, so that's my backstory, and why Tim asked me to give this talk, I have absolutely no idea, because I am not an expert in literature. I am a historian. And so for the expertise, you're going to have to rely on the next two speakers, namely Tom Holland and Bettany Hughes, my dear friends, and indeed collaborators on many, many projects, both written and visual. One final personal thing. Today would have been my mother's 99th birthday, as it happens. And so with that strong woman, I move on to another very strong woman, namely Mary Renault. And that, by the way, is how I believe she pronounced this nom de plume, Mary Renault. If you read David Sweetman's biography, I hadn't known this before, I'd always called her Mary Renault. She allegedly referred to herself as Mary Renault. She was, of course, a vintage vehicle. Nevertheless, in fact, one of my very first cars was a Renault Dauphine. But I mustn't linger too much anyway. So we have a small slideshow, just 12 slides, which, as I say, Carol has prepared. And we start off with the title and the pot at the top, which is an Attic red figure, kilix, that's to say a goblet, shallow, for boozing, basically. Boozing mixed wine, wine mixed with water, and I'll come on to why the modern Greek for wine is krasi and not oinos or inos. And I take my further title as a kind of pun or a parody of the title of what was the first Mary Renault novel that I read. When I was about 16, I was at school and I was in a kind of relationship that bore some relation to the central relationship of the book, which is the guiding thread through the last of the wine. First of the wine and drinking deep is, of course, an analogy to another writer. So, the last of the wine is set during the Peloponnesian War, or the Atheno-Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404. The outer limits of the book, chronologically, are about 430, which is when Alexias was born, and 402, which is the year after Athens recovers its freedom and its democracy, having gone down in flames, defeated by Sparta, and then having to suffer a year of extremely unpleasant oligarchic dictatorship. And Alexias, at the age of about 16, through Socrates, of course everybody gets a mention in this wonderful novel, meets Lysis, or Lysis, and he was a real person, and Plato wrote a dialogue named Lysis. Alexias is not an ancient Greek name. Alexis, Alexandros, but not Alexias, so she made that up. And they form a pair, a homoerotic, pederastic pair. And Lysis is about 7 years older than Alexias in the novel. So when they meet, he's about 23, and Alexias is about 16. And it follows the careers of these two against the backdrop of the final decade of the Peloponnesian War, where Athens actually suffers terribly. Athens makes mistakes, and it loses a big battle. It loses a big campaign in Sicily, suffers 2 oligarchic counter-revolutions, and then it finally suffers a terrible defeat. And Alexias lives all through this. He survives. But Lysis, in Mary Renault's version, survives the end of the war, survives to join the democratic resistance. This is one of those heroic moments in ancient Greek history, especially Athenian democratic history. But he dies in the battle fought in the Piraeus, whereby the democratic resistors overthrow the foul 30 oligarchs. But in that battle, though Lysis dies, Alexias kills the main leader of the tyrants, Critias, as they say in Greek, Critias. And there's a famous passage in Xenophon, one of Mary Renault's main sources, where the oligarchs have taken over, but they've fallen out. And there's a more moderate oligarchic tendency set against a more extreme oligarchic tendency. Where have we heard this before? And among the moderates, the most prominent is a man called Theramenes. And Critias condemns a kangaroo court, Theramenes to death. It's sort of like a Stalinist assassination, really. But Theramenes is a man of great presence, and he has a glass of wine, a cup of wine. He throws out the lees, and he says this to the fair Critias. Deeply ironic moment. And we'll come on to why that's relevant to the story that Mary Renault has to tell. The hook, that's to say, how have we got this book? What is it? Well, according to Mary Renault, it's a memoir which was written by Alexias in 375 or so, when, towards the end of his life, he's looking back on his relationship and on the Peloponnesian War. And it's discovered by Alexias's homonymous grandson, the Greek mode of naming your son one thing and then he names his oldest son after his father. So Alexias Jr. publishes it. Not the last time that trope was used. Valerio Massimo Manfredi used it for his Alexander trilogy, which he pretends is the lost memoirs of Ptolemy. Well, these memoirs are completely fictional. But nonetheless brilliant for that. So let's take us through the slides. There is the title page, the last one. This is the most recent incarnation. My 1956 version, of course, didn't have the same cover, which is far more artistic. And of course, it didn't have a, I'll just see if this, no, it doesn't, sorry, work. I thought there might be a pointer. I'll just see if there is. No. At the top, if you can see it, is a quote, a puff by Hilary Mantel, whom we in Cambridge recently gave an honorary doctorate to. She is one of the most distinguished currently writing historical novelists, but probably could not have been as popular or as successful but for the example of Mary Renault. And the introduction is by Charlotte Mendelssohn. Oddly, I think, Mary Renault herself does not add an author's note, at least not in this edition. And I hunted for my original one. I don't know if there was one, but it became her habit as a sort of sop, really, to scholars, just in case they thought she was making it all up. She wanted them to realize how carefully and how widely she'd read in the ancient sources. So this book is based fundamentally, I've already mentioned Xenophon, and secondly, based on Plutarch. Plutarch wrote several lives of contemporaries that she draws upon. Now, she was not the last to write a novel based in the Peloponnesian War. In fact, she wasn't the first. The one that I think of in that context is Naomi Matheson, who in 1932, when she was having, shall we say, a relationship with a certain professor in this university, a very distinguished Greek historian, she wrote a book called Cloud Cuckoo Land, and that was based in the Peloponnesian War. Here you have on the screen on the left, a very interesting novel because it's about a defeat. Spartans are famous for winning various battles, but actually they're most famous for one they lost, the Battle of Thermopylae. Well, this one is a much less well-known story. It's in Thucydides. It took place in 425 BC. And it's a way into getting at what the Spartans were like in an extremely intimate way, and what it meant for them to lose an important battle in the Peloponnesian War. On the right, Stephen Pressfield, better known for his Thermopylae novel, Gates of Fire, which is mentioned at the bottom there. Huge following. Pressfield, like myself, is an honorary citizen of modern Sparta. If you go to his website and if you look up Gates of Fire, you'll find a huge litany of comments from vets, and that's the American for people who are veterans of warfare, going right back to the Korean War in the 50s and acknowledging the impact of Pressfield's book, the way he seems to have echoed their very own feelings about war, having been in very nasty kinds, of course, of modern war. And that's a very frequent reaction also to Mary Renault's work, the sort of sense of, yeah, that's exactly how it was, even if possibly one has never experienced exactly what she's writing about. Two more novels of the Peloponnesian War. Rosemary Sutcliffe, again better known for her Eagle of the Ninth, of which a movie was made not so long ago. And this is a story which focuses on Alcibiades, whose name was Spartan, but he was, of course, as Athenian as you can get, except when he went as a traitor to live in Sparta for quite a long time and allegedly fathered a child on one of the queens of the Spartans. So quite a dramatic, romantic interlude. On the right, a comic novel, Tom Holt Redgrave's here. And it's setting up, it's looked at from the point of view of Eupolis, who was the greatest rival of Aristophanes. So if you want a really rude picture, i.e. very negative, critical of Aristophanes, you get it in comedy through the mouth of Eupolis in The Walled Orchard. So, wine, last of the wine. The Symposium, which means a drinking together, our word symposium is the Latin form of the Greek, is a drinking together with possibly added sex. The food is separate. But it generated not just an enormous literature, poems, sympotic poetry, but also a famous series of vases, as we call them, pots, you might like to call them, made in the potter's quarter, the Keramikos of Athens, by possibly slaves, quite often, as well as foreigners who are free, not always Athenians by any means, though the pot shops were typically owned by Athenian citizens. And they found their way, of course, all over the Mediterranean. And if you see a whole pot like this, you know that it comes from a grave, because any other kinds of pots in sanctuaries or in settlement sites, they get crushed, broken. You can't extinguish pottery. You have to grind it to dust to destroy it. But you don't get whole pots. So this is the sort of thing that you'd find in an Etruscan chamber tomb, which then would be excavated or plundered, very often more recently plundered, and then find its way on the art market or find its way into a museum. And this particular example is, if I'm not mistaken, in the Louvre. And it's called the Niobe or Niobids crater because Niobe made the terrible mistake of challenging, being rude to Leto. And Leto happened to be the mother of Apollo and Artemis. And Niobe said, Leto, you have only 2 children. I have 14. 7 boys, 7 girls. Well, they didn't take it well. And Apollo and Artemis, and that's Apollo in the middle, Artemis on the left, took it out and slaughtered, murdered all 14 of Niobe's children. Famous myth. And Apollo was, of course, the subject of one other of Mary Renault's novels, The Mask of Apollo, set in 4th century BC in a theatre group. I'm very fond of it personally. So that was a crater, that's to say a mixing bowl, from the Greek kerenumi, to mix. And if you go to Greece today and you want to stand around, what you say is, I will mix, θα κεράσω. And Greek for wine is krasi, because the ancient Greeks used always to mix their wine with water, normally in 3 parts water to 1 part wine, krasi. This is a stamnos. Well, I've put on the top mixing jar, and it's possible that wine could be mixed in it, but it's also certainly used as a storage jar. And you can see on the left, the lady on the left is holding either a stamnos, this one has a lid, therefore it's a storage jar, or she's holding an amphora, which is a vessel in which you carry wine or water or whatever. And beneath it is another item of drinking repertoire, the sympathetic repertoire. It's a high-swung, handled skiphos, not the classiest, not like the kilix you saw right at the beginning. This is a slightly lower grade. But all this furniture, and it's a very ritualized type of entertainment, was men, free adult male citizen men only, typically of an elite status, and that is the background from which both Elixias and Lysis come. Sometimes said that Mary Renault was not so good at dealing with working class or lower class characters, more sympathetic perhaps towards the elites of the ancient world and indeed of the more recent worlds. The Last of the Wine, I should say, was her 7th novel, her first ancient novel. And this is a vessel used to cool wine, a psiktia, and it depicts the exact antithesis of the respectable Greek adult male citizen. This is the disreputable, the followers of the god of wine, Dionysus, the god of metamorphosis. These are satyrs, and they have a horsey tail, they have big bushy beards, and they are, well, animal, bestial. And they drink their wine straight from the skin. They don't pour it from a nice red figure vessel, and they glug it rather than sip it. And they do so in a most inelegant posture, as opposed to reclining elegantly on a couch. Another drinker, and depicted heroically nude, but again with, I think, a little bit of humor. The cup on the left is the whole vessel. This is the scene on the exterior. And the vessel in his hand is called an oinokoi, which literally means a pourer of oinos, of wine. And he shouldn't be pouring it into what looks like his mouth. But he's, of course, also a bit of an acrobat or a juggler, because he's able to balance Achilles, undecorated, apparently, on his extended left arm. He's heroically nude, typically uncircumcised. This is how the Greeks were. And it's in your face. This is wine. I found this one, obviously one finds everything now online, but this is a particularly odd image, because the person holding the very deep skiphos and wielding it on a couch with a very nice piece of embroidered material behind is actually a naked woman, and in ancient Greek terms, to be naked and female instantly was to be dismissed as being either a porne, which is somebody literally bought, so a common street walker, or if this is more likely to be a more upper class type of working girl, this is a hetaera, which is the euphemism for a companion. And so this is where the sex come in. Now what she's doing is playing kotobos, names on the top, and that is the game whereby as we've had with Theramenes. You get to the bottom of the wine, and quite often it's full of lees. You toss them out. Well, in The Last of the Wine, there's a scene where Alexias and Lysis are dining together, just alone. They're not in a bigger symposium. And Lysis has been practicing. And what he's been practicing is trying to throw the lees out in such a way that it forms the Greek letter alpha, which is, of course, the first letter of Alexias' name. And Mary Renault says he managed to do it typically 3 times out of 4, which suggests that he drank a great deal of wine and practiced extremely hard. And so this is the institutional, situational setting within which the relationship of Lysis, and Alexias develops. Paiderastia, the eros erastia, means violent physical desire. It's not philia, love, affection. This is sexual desire. Pais is any male or female. A female can be a pais, up to the age of adulthood. So in the case of a girl, puberty plus marriage. In the case of a boy, up to the age of 18 or so. And as we've seen, Alexias was notionally 16 when he met Lysis. Well, this boy is represented as considerably younger, but nevertheless, the painter has given the impression, which is obviously what he wishes to convey, of the age gulf between the two. The older man, who is also cloaked, is bearded. And we're in a athletic scene, because you've got the sponge bag, as it were, hanging in the palaestra. And I'm going to show you another example of that implement down the bottom between them. And in the plot of the Last of the Wine, Alexias is a particularly brilliant long-distance runner. He actually wins a crown at the Isthmian Games of 412. His older partner, Lysis, also competes in that same games at Corinth, but he competes in the Pancration. And he comes, because there were no weight regulations, he comes up against a mountain of a man who simply lies on him until almost the breath has been squeezed out of Lysis, together, of course, with breaking bones. And the key thing is that Lysis must not die, because if Lysis dies, posthumously he wins, because you can't win an Olympic victory by killing your opponent. So Mary Renault gets all that absolutely right. It's a brilliant scene, very, very moving indeed. And continuing the athletic scene, and this will be my last slide. This is the inside, the tondo, as it's called, of Achilles. And I put it on not just for the swastika on the discus, but also see that same implement again. It was used for marking out where you land when you do the long jump. And on the right-hand side, hanging on the palaestra, the wrestling ground, the exercise ground wall, are 2 halteres. These are jumping weights. Because when you do the long jump, you wind yourself up with these weights and then hurl them forward as you jump off, and then bring them back while you're in the air and land. That's the long jump. So the combination of those tells you this guy is a pentathlete. He's going in for the 5 competition event. And his name, or is it his name, or is it just the name that the guy who commissioned the pot wanted to have put on the pot, is Clare, famous, melos, for his song, or famous in song. And of course, I mentioned homoerotic, sympotic literature. Very often was hymning the virtues, physical, mental, of the beloved, the eromenos, in this case, Kleomenos. Alexias was the eromenos of Lysis, but their relationship persisted beyond the adulthood of Alexias. Lysis gets married, and then when he's killed, Alexias marries his widow. I think it's an absolute, this is one of those books, I read it every time and I tear up. Sometimes I bawl, sometimes I just get teary. And so that's the end of my little presentation, but I just thought I'd end with a few general reflections on the work as a whole. If you like a bit of scholarship after the light entertainment. Well, Mary Renault does nod. In other words, she occasionally gets dates wrong. She talks of the Senate of Athens. Ooh, that, I wince when I read it, instead of the council. She spells polymarchos, poly, with a Y-I-upsilon, markos, which is a nonsense. It's polemarchos. She doesn't know the Greek words polemos, archon. She thinks poly goes into markos. But these are very, very trivial defects. She far more often gets things right. And it's sometimes said she's not so good on women. Well, I beg to differ a bit on that, because I think her depiction of Alexius' stepmother, that's to say, his father's first wife dies, and then he remarries, of course, much, much younger woman, actually younger than Alexius. But the way in which their relationship is depicted, especially while the father is away in Sicily, he's captured after the battle in the great harbour, and he's put into the stone quarries, but he survives. He comes back and he's horrified to find that the daughter that he now has, he told Alexius to dispose of the daughter, who his wife was pregnant when he went off to Sicily. And she gives birth to a daughter, and he says, if she gives birth to a daughter, dispose of it. Mary Renault has no qualms about bringing out this, to us, extremely distasteful feature of ancient Athenian and Greek society. But the relationship between Alexius and his stepmother is, I think, very tenderly drawn and extremely well drawn. As Dame Elish said, I've worked a lot on Sparta. I did my doctorate on Sparta with John Boardman. So I thought, for the hell of it, reading it for, I don't know, the 10th time, I'll count the references to Sparta or Spartans to see whether, were I now to write a novel about ancient Sparta, I could cobble together those references. And there are about 75 of them. And they do actually cover the waterfront. You really could write a fairly respectable novel just based on her references to Sparta and Spartans. So the final point I want to make is that at one point she uses the expression honey from the rock. So something sweet coming out of something very tough. And I don't know if you read in yesterday's paper, but there was an interview with Simon Callow, the actor, in the Daily Telegraph. He was the first actor, the first thespian, a male, to come out, i.e. to reveal that he was homosexual, that he was gay. Well, this summer, he is getting married. And he's marrying a man about half his age, I think, which is sort of ancient Greek. But what I cite him for is because in this interview, he says, I'm getting married on a Greek island. Why? Because the ancient Greeks were the first people, the first culture, within which homosexuality was not just permissible, but legitimated in a very positive way. And so he's, as it were, paying homage to the sort of situation that Mary Renault was paying homage to in The Last of the Wine. So if you have been, thank you for listening.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. That was fabulous. And we're going to continue our discussion about Mary Renault and Renault now in a discussion panel. And just while we are putting the furniture together to accommodate that, I'll introduce those who are on our panel. Delighted to say that Professor Tim Rood will chair this panel and discussion. And participating along with Paul will be Bettany Hughes, who's author of Helen of Troy and the Hemlock Cup. And again, she'll be very well known to so many of you here. She has written and presented over 50 television and radio documentaries for the BBC and other broadcasters, including the series on the Spartans and on ancient ways. She's also a patron of Classics for All and the Iris Project, both campaigns to support classical language and the study of classical civilizations in state schools. Among numerous awards and honours are a special award for services to Hellenic culture and heritage from the Greek Department of Culture, and an honorary doctorate from York University and the Distinguished Friend of Oxford Award. Along with Bettany, Tom Holland is with us again. Delighted to welcome both of you here tonight. We're really honoured at your presence here tonight at this discussion. Tom is the author of 5 best-selling historical works covering Greek, Roman and medieval history: Rubicon, Persian Fire, Millennium, In the Shadow of the Sword, and most recently Dynasty, or Dynasty, depending on which particular aspect of the word you come from.
Dynasty.
Thank you. I suspect it might happen as a principal in Oxford who read many of the Morse novels. He is a presenter of BBC Radio 4's Making History. He has written and presented a number of television documentaries on subjects ranging from religion to dinosaurs, and has translated Herodotus for Penguin Classics, and in 2007 was a winner of the Classical Association Prize, awarded to the individual who has done most to promote the study of the language, literature and civilization of ancient Greece and Rome. And with that wonderful panel, we can't have other than a wonderful discussion. Tim.
Hi, I'm Tim Rood, the classics tutor. I'm delighted to welcome an extra person on our panel, who is, I'm going to be sitting down there actually, who is Donna Kunam from Little Brown, published through Virago, have published all of Mary Renault's works, and who commissioned introductions from both Tom and Bettany. So they're going to be talking about their sort of experiences of revisiting the works of Mary Renault, or Mary Renault, as I should now say. Over to Donna, Bettany and Tom.
Can I just say something quickly before we start? Three things, in fact, very quickly. You should know that Donna knew precisely 34 minutes ago that she was going to be on the podium with us tonight. Tom and I kind of strong-armed her into joining us, so she's not being falsely modest when she says she's spontaneously asking the questions. I'd also like to put out a plea. Tom and I talked about Mary Renault at the Hay Festival, and we don't know why she wanted her name to be pronounced in that way. Somebody in the audience advanced the interesting theory that Renault produced tanks for the Germans during the war, and she didn't want to be associated with Renault. But we suspect somebody in this room might know the answer. So if you do, please chip in. Also, just to say that Professor Paul Cartledge extremely graciously described us as experts on Mary Renault. I don't know, I would like to speak for Tom here, but I think we're probably not experts, but rather enthusiasts.
Time will tell.
Yeah, indeed.
So, hello all. I'm the editorial director of the Virago Modern Classics list, and over the last few years we've been bringing all of Mary Renault's fiction back into print, and it's something that we've been enormously proud to do. For me, she's an incredible novelist. She mixes psychological insight with real solid historical research, and one of the ways that we can reissue books and get people to discover them is by incorporating introductions, and both Tom and Bettany jumped at the chance to introduce these books for me. And they've been brilliant champions. I'm so pleased that they agreed to do it, partly because they're doing talks like this now to support her work. So the first questions I'd like to ask you about her is, when did you first discover Mary Renault? Bettany first.
Well, I was probably a bit too young, probably younger than I should have been. I think I was somewhere between 10 and 11. So it was eye-opening, I will say. My parents were both actors and left school at 14 and 16 respectively. So we had a house full of books, but it wasn't an academic household. And because they were actors, it meant they were out of work pretty much the whole time. And the only job that they could guarantee getting was the summer season. So I spent my childhood extremely happily on very windswept, stony English beaches while they were doing the summer season. And because I was brought up in the 60s and the 70s, then children were just allowed to kind of roam free. And I wandered into a library and was given this polythene-covered book by a very enthusiastic librarian, a very interesting choice, I think, to give to a single 10-year-old girl who just wandered in. But it was the most brilliant choice. So I remember sitting on these chilly, dank English beaches, opening this book, and this extraordinary, hot, heady, spirit-filled, soulful world opening up in front of my eyes. And I just thought, this is where I want to be. And that is the reason I ended up at Oxford studying ancient history. So I owe everything
What an inspiration.
to Mary Renault. Yeah.
And how about you, Tom? When did you first discover?
When I was 13, and I came to it from a pre-existing interest in Greek and Roman history. And I picked up Fire from Heaven, which back in those days, of course, was not published by Virago, but I think published by Penguin. And I can still vividly remember it. It was the famous portrait bust of Alexander with a black background. And maybe because of that, in my memory, the novel, the effect that it had on my imagination was kind of golden. So it was as though the whiteness of the marble on that cover was lit by a kind of internal goldness. And that is very true to the way that Mary Renault portrayed Alexander in her novel. And I also kind of fell in love with Alexander. It is a love letter to him. And I then went on to read The Persian Boy. And those of you who have read it will remember that it opens with the eponymous Persian boy being castrated. And those of you who are male and have read it, I'm sure, will remember the experience of reading it and going like that. It was the first time I'd realised what it might actually mean to become a eunuch. So that was an unsettling experience. And then I devoured them all. And I think the one that most vividly stuck in my memory was The King Must Die. Less so, I think, for the inherent qualities of the novel, which I perhaps wasn't old enough to appreciate, but because one of the things that I was really obsessed by was books that told me what legends and myths were really about. And this was an entire subgenre in the local library. So books about the Trojan War, books about the Arthurian myths, books about the Old Testament, books about Atlantis, anything that would say this is what really happened. And of course, The King Must Die is predicated on this notion that what seems fantastical in the myths might well have a logical explanation that can be drawn from history. I mean, I now don't believe that. I don't think it works as simplistically as that. But that, for me, also was a fundamental part of the appeal. So the two books, I guess, that most lived in my memory were the Alexander one and the Theseus one. And that is very fortunate that we're both particularly qualified to talk about those, because those are the ones that we went on to cover for Virago.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that you fell in love with Alexander after reading the Alexander.
Well, this was very much a time where it was not acceptable for young boys to be gay. Yeah. It was absolutely a term of abuse, homo, whatever. But I read it and really wanted to be gay. Because Alexander was absolutely sort of model of how cool it was to be gay. And so I'd sort of think, oh, maybe I am gay. Well, I'm not. But I'll give it a go.
When I asked you to write the introduction, you both reread these books. You spoke to me for quite a while on the phone about how you first discovered them. But how did the books fare on rereading? Were there any further insights that you got from them?
I think I read them very tentatively because I really did think that they changed my life, and I hadn't gone back to them. So it was that awful suspicion that you might open it up and actually they would fail you on a second reading. I probably wasn't quite as enamoured and as in love as I had been on that chilly English beach, but I think I learned different things from all the books that I reread. And what it really reminded me is exactly what Tom is saying, that it makes you realise that she encourages you to think that there are other ways of being. I mean, there's this very beautiful phrase that she uses herself when she was interviewed, when she talks about, she thinks that many people are, what she calls it, intersexed, and she sort of says it with this rather kind of crisp, secure smile. And I remember realising actually that had made me a much more open-minded person reading her books. So it was a joy to read those again, to understand that. As Paul has said, some of the history you then having learnt the history, you realise it wasn't entirely accurate. It's sort of a dance with antiquity that she does, that she encourages us to remember the aphorisms of some of the greats. But I was actually, what I was struck by is how she completely guided my life. So the fact that I'd then gone on to specialise in Socrates, in Amazons, in eunuchs, they were all there on the page. So I think I kind of owe her a much greater debt of gratitude than I'd even realised. And I also think that when you look at how she deals with history, even if sometimes she gets the dates wrong or the names wrong, there is a kind of very interesting, deeper truth that she's accessing. And what struck me is that she was imagining historical truths when they were still buried at the time that she was writing them. So things that we only know now thanks to technology. So the fact that we can analyse the interior of pots and realise that in the Bronze Age they were drinking this incredibly heady mix of wine and retsina and honey mead, which we have since replicated, you'll be pleased to hear. And my goodness, you have a great night. And my goodness, you have a really bad head the next morning. So these kind of, heady worlds that she was describing are absolutely there in the archaeology. And the sound of a city preparing for war. There's a beautiful fragment, a new Sophocles fragment that was published in 2007 from the Oxyrhynchus papyri here in Oxford, and it talks about the kind of the song of the shuttles and the whir and the sound of swords being sharpened. And again, Mary put all of these onto the page. So I think I was very impressed with the power of her imagination to actually, it's almost to see and taste and hear a world which she thought she was dreaming up, but which we are then finding in the archaeological reality. So I was a tiny bit disappointed by the actual writing, but kind of delighted in what I found on the page.
How about you?
Well, going back to Fire from Heaven, of course it didn't measure up to the pleasure that it had given me when I was 13, because it was one of the supreme reading experiences of my life. And that was precisely, I guess, why I hadn't gone back to it. Yeah. There was no way that coming back to it when I was, 46, that it could possibly compare, because no book that you read later in life can ever compare with the joy of a book when you were 13 and you just cannot put it down, and it completely influences you. So that was a given. However, there were aspects to it that I realised I simply had not appreciated when I was 13, and which I think I found unsettling. But the fact that I found them unsettling was precisely what still, for me, makes it a brilliant portrayal of antiquity, because there are aspects to its politics, I think it would be fair to say, that are truer to the world of Alexander than perhaps to the world of Guardian editorials and BBC think tanks now, of which one would be certainly the enthusiasm for violence and war and conquest, the enthusiasm for Alexander himself, the notion that invading Iraq is necessarily a good thing. I read this after the Iraq War. I think that's more problematic perhaps than Mary Renault would have thought. The other aspect to it, which is very odd and which Bettany touched on, is the fact that she is certainly, whether this is her or whether it's a fictional persona, she is really very hostile to the idea of being a woman. Alexander, throughout it, he's endlessly kind of repeating that rabbinical comment, how let us thank God that we have been born men and not women. And he describes women as their voices as twittering like birds, that they are immured within walls, that they cannot get out and enjoy the thrill of killing people. And that seems to me to be very true to Greece, to ancient Greece. And I think I doubt that a woman trying to get inside Alexander's mind now, would feel as comfortable as I suspect Mary Renault did in writing in that manner. And it means that when I came on to The Persian Boy, I think that is without a doubt her greatest book. And it seems to me great now as an exemplary book for our age, in which issues about gender, identity, the difference and the synergy between male and female has become a topic of pressing interest. And in the figure of Bagoas, this boy who looks like a girl, who is as tough as any Macedonian soldier in Alexander's army, but who can seduce him and keep him entertained in his bed as perfectly as the most practiced concubine. You have an absolutely archetypally 2016 figure. So in a sense, oddly, and this must be the mark of a great work of literature, it seems to open up vistas that would not have been as obvious when she wrote it. And so it is a book, I realise now, that certainly looks back to the complexities of gender politics and identity in the Hellenistic era, but also oddly and prophetically looks forward to our concerns now in 2016. So I think that I was hugely impressed by that. And also by Funeral Games, which is the last novel in the trilogy about the Funeral Games, refers to the contest among Alexander's generals following his death. And it's a lesser novel than the two earlier ones. But again, it struck me in the same way that the attitude towards women is very, very striking, and coming from a female author, very odd. And there is a particularly memorable moment where I think it's Eurydice who is she wants to be a player in this Game of Thrones, and it is a kind of Game of Thrones. Well, no, it is a Game of Thrones. And running throughout, there is this idea that she wished she'd been a boy. She's a kind of militarist George from the famous Five. She wished she'd been a boy, and she could be a boy. She could rule as a man. And she approaches the climactic moment where she's going out to address an army, and then her period kicks in. Mm-hmm. And it's a very odd moment.
You do wonder, I mean, that is the question all the time when you're reading it, how much you're meeting her, the author, directly on the page. And as you say, Tom, and particularly in the Theseus novels, I think, there's an interest in the ideas of the time. There's a sort of notion, of a matriarchy. So if you don't know the story, it kind of kicks off with Theseus turning up at this land where the queen is paramount and she has a young king for a year, and then the young king is sacrificed. And that sort of plays into all those conversations that were happening in the 60s and the 70s, and the discovery of Çatalhöyük in Turkey, and was this an age where there was
but
a
it's also
crime
very Robert
mother?
Graves, isn't it?
It's very
White
completely,
and,
totally. But as you say, what's also very interesting is you look at the women. She talks about the whispering confidences of women, and they seem to kind of sweat their lives out rather peevishly in these claustrophobic chambers. And you do wonder how much of that is her remembering her days at school, where she was famously big-boned and had her mother kind of berated her for having big feet. And you get the sense there were probably some quite bitchy girls who looked at this bookish Eleanor and just Eileen and didn't enjoy the fact that she was sitting and reading and being clever and seeking out Plato in the library. So I think you're getting an interesting collision of both her own personal times and the times that she was writing.
But also, I may be over-psychologizing here, but she left a grey, ration book-bound Britain for South Africa, and the light and the colour of that. And I think that maybe you get the same feeling that when as Alexander or as Theseus or whoever, she is imagining what it is like to be a woman, to be stuck inside, to be living a life of shadow, of not being out in the sun, of not being out in the light. perhaps that's playing on her mind,
Yeah.
that she was leaving Britain. I mean, also, but I think also having said that, from what I've read of her biography, her training as a nurse seems to have been, I mean, really, Paul's a citizen of Sparta, but Mary Renault seems to really live the Spartan life and that. And that, there's a kind of militarist cast to her training as a nurse that perhaps fed it.
Talk about the wars and the visceral.
Yes.
And also bodies. I mean, that's what's interesting. She deals with the male body so confidently, but that's because she, as a young nurse, dealt with the male body very confidently when she was treating these young wounded men from Dunkirk. And interestingly, as a woman who liked other women, she would have seen more naked men than every other heterosexual woman in Oxford.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading, rereading Fire from Heaven, and it opens with a scene that echoes a scene in The Charioteer, which is, I think, her last novel set in contemporary England. And the hero, he wakes up and he sees his father packing and leaving and never sees him again.
Heartbreaking.
Yes. And there's a rather similar scene that opens Far From Heaven where the young Alexander gets up and he's trying to find his mother. And there is Philip, his father, who's just come back. And there's an absolutely hideous description of Philip's very erect penis. Yes. And I sort of read it, blimey. And I realised I didn't remember that at all. What was I thinking? I was 13 and I didn't remember that at all. Maybe I didn't know what it was referring to.
Yeah. She has a sort of steely sympathy, doesn't she, for the wounded man? I mean, that's the sense that you get. And interesting, I think, as well, what you were saying, Tom, about her moving to South Africa. And she describes the atmosphere as very party-ish, and they lived in a kind of beach house called Delos. And, she obviously really enjoyed her time there and spent a lot of time looking at the stars and imagining the stars. And the stars appear a lot, particularly in the historical novels. But you also do wonder that famously her parents were very unhappy. There was a lot of slamming of doors, and she used to take herself off and write by herself. And it was actually her aunt, I think, who paid for her to go to school and encouraged her to go to school. And you hear that throughout her life she always wanted the windows open and the doors open, that she was very anxious about being enclosed. And you definitely sense that what she's recapturing onto the page is a land and a landscape and a mental landscape that is wide open, where the sun is allowed to penetrate.
Which is, I'm sure, the appeal of Greece, because that is ever since the time of Byron, the Isles of Greece is where you go to escape, the tight little island of Britain.
Yes.
It seems that in going to ancient Greece, she was able to get the freedom to write about what she wanted to write about.
Yes, and of course the freedom to write about sexuality in the way that she wanted to.
There's a great, sorry to interrupt you, but there's this lovely line that she has in The Bull from the Sea. It's the mark of a little man to like only what they know, one step beyond, and this little man feels the black cold of chaos. And you think she's absolutely applying that to what it is to be human.
And that is why Alexander is the paradigmatic hero for her. Yeah. That she has no reservations about whether it's correct to go and slaughter vast quantities of people across the world and invade Iraq. Absolutely, that's what you do. How boring to be stuck in your...
Paul has been sitting like
No.
Freud
This is your show, not mine. But I just wanted to pitch in on Alexander and Far From Heaven, which I agree with you is extremely powerful. But I wrote a little book on Alexander myself, so I was very conscious of the sources and the difference between what most of them are is fiction and reality, and how does one get there? Well, that book is unlike Last of the Wine, for which there are tons of different sorts of evidence. For that, she based it on 7 chapters of Plutarch's life of Alexander, because people weren't interested in his first 20 years. They were interested after he became king, age 20. And so it's a fantastic feat of recreation. And that scene, he not only was his erect penis dwelt upon, but his hairy body, his beard, and the fact he had one eye.
Yes.
And she uses this psycho-historically as part of her explanation of why Alexander, and there is evidence, not necessarily very good, that he wasn't that keen on the sexual act with women. She uses that experience that you graphically described as the psychological explanation of why he was not, like most men of his background and age, wishing to screw the nearest female, ad nauseam.
But what she also draws on, of course, which is also true to Alexander, is the myth of Achilles and Patroclus, which Alexander was certainly aware of, and his relationship with Hephaestion was very consciously modelled on that of Achilles and Patroclus. And so that Homeric quality, I found, is very powerfully rendered, and therefore it's a very aristocratic book. Again, Paul, you said how she identifies with the elite. It's very striking in Far From Heaven that Demosthenes, who by and large in fiction is cast as the hero, the defender of democracy, is cast as this kind of slimy windbag, and generally in fiction, the democracy of Athens is a good thing. The heroes defend it. People who attack it are generally the villains. But in Far From Heaven, the Athenian democracy is shabby and low down. And so there's a faint hint, I think, of the fascist about Far From Heaven.
Some people...
And in that, and I think that in that it is kind of true to the character of the Hellenistic age.
I wonder if something else that she got right, and I don't know if you'd agree in the audience and up here, is that, as you say, Tom, she reduces myths to something which is much more quotidian, so she kind of rationally explains what the bull is, who Theseus is, what...
Although, as I say, Far From Heaven, I think has an authentically mythic resonance.
And I think there's something which is doubly authentic in the sense, in the kind of true sense of both the myth and the epic, is that what she seems to understand is that in the one thing I think that we can know about the past is that they inhabited a world where the physical space was a kind of, I'm going to use a terrible phrase now, but a psychophysical parcel, so that in every breath of wind there was a god. When the quince ripened on the tree, there was a spiritual reason, a sublime reason for that happening. And I think we see that in Homer, the kind of use of similes in Homer means you're never just in one place, you're both in two times at once and two places at once. And that's something which I think she captures entirely brilliantly in all of the novels, that this is a world, again, I'm using a horrible phrase, but a 360-degree world where there's an awful lot going on around you. And it seems, whatever the kind of historical accuracy, there is something about that, and I think we can understand that both from the literature that we have and from the archaeology, and even from the kind of dull bits of cuneiform, when we kind of jigsaw puzzling together those earlier worlds. That seems to me her brilliance, is to shift really and to understand both how different it was and how rich it would have been to walk through those landscapes.
Tom, something you pick up on your introduction is how adept she is at looking at these characters that we only know from myths and from bits of scholarship, how she makes them into fully believable humans and the psychology that's behind it.
Yes, well, yes. I think she, as far as I remember, she does not actually include the gods in any of her books, does she? I don't think the gods intervene, but one place where the supernatural does kick in is the end of The Bull from the Sea, where Theseus gets an intimation of the Battle of Marathon that is to come, and that he will fight at the Battle of Marathon, which he is supposed to have done. And I remember as a child, the Persian Wars were a particular obsession. And I remember a constant feeling of frustration that she never actually really did the Persian Wars. There was that, and she has Simonides, who writes the epitaph for the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, is the hero of the praise singer. But again, as I remember, Persian Wars don't really come into that. Does it? I mean, it's kind of a frustration. But I now wonder, was the reason that she did that it was simply too extraordinary a story? it would have overwhelmed her, because likewise she doesn't actually describe Alexander's campaigns. We follow his movements through the east of the Persian Empire, but through the prism of a eunuch who obviously is not taking part in it. And so there's almost the sort of sense of like a Greek tragedy, that the action, the violence, the murder is happening off stage, and maybe that's the reason.
So I think have we come to the end of our discussion time now?
I think we can have another 5 minutes. But yes, or
This
some
is-
questions from the audience, which should some of you
Be
want
gentle
to
with us.
ask. You do have a ring mic, I think, Jen. Do you have that?
If not, then we can maybe just speak up.
Yes, it's a small room. Isn't
It's
it?
not too big.
Okay.
I just wanted to say she did actually do the Persian Wars in a children's book called
Did she?
Line in the Gateway.
Oh, that blows my theory out.
For younger children, but because of that, it was the first Mary Reynolds book that my children read, and it does thoroughly cover the Xerxes invasion, and not so much marathon. So it's got the Ghost of Dracula in the Dry, it's got the 300th Thermopylae.
I will. Maybe Virago can release that.
Yeah.
Well, we are publishing for younger readers now, so.
Does anybody here know the Renault reason? The lady at the back, yeah.
Yes, she read a play, whose name I forget, which was a French play in which there was a character whose last name was Renault. So she takes it from that, and when she's asked by David Sweetman, she says it's the pronunciation is completely up to you, which is interesting because it makes it quite liminal whether you pronounce it Renault, as most people do,
Yeah.
or Renault. It is, in some ways, it's a fabrication. It's made up.
Yeah.
And it isn't who she is, except it is who she is as an author. So it's quite open.
Hmm. But she did prefer Renault, though.
But the impression I get from her interviews is that she enjoyed teasing interviewers,
Yeah.
and she enjoyed saying things that threw them off beat. I mean, so she sort of said that she was against gay liberation movement, I think, which she clearly can't have been. But
She also says the most beautiful thing in one of her interviews, which they say, how would you like to be remembered? And she says, I'd like people to think that I was on the right side, humanly speaking. And shouldn't we all have that carved on our tombstones, if we were indeed on the right side?
which I guess was prompted by her role in the anti-apartheid movement.
Partly, I think. But I think it was more than just political, actually.
But when you think that she was one of the first people to write a novel with 2 homosexual characters that didn't end in tragedy, she was certainly a very human, understanding and brave writer, I think.
But I think also that writing, sitting in South Africa, writing about heroes who are generally from the elite, who nevertheless their standard of living and everything that they are is dependent upon the labour of a slave class. I imagine that she could not help but be aware of the parallels that existed between her own status as a wealthy white person living in apartheid South Africa. And so that must have been an aspect, that played on her. She was prominent in the campaign against apartheid, but I would imagine that as someone who had moved to South Africa, that would have been something that caused her anxiety. I don't know enough about her role in the anti-apartheid movement to say about that, but I would think it would be a part of it.
That's really insightful.
Any more questions?
To what extent do you think, in the American background of American democracy in the 1950s, it's important in the presentation of the imminent death of Socrates in The Last of the Wine, the book which ends with a reference to un-Athenian activities, which is very much contemporary. And just as a second question, and that novel starts with a character drinking hemlock when their lover has just caught the plague and they feel themselves weakening and they straight away, the character drinks hemlock. It ends with very clear foreshadowings of the hemlock cup of Socrates. So I just wanted to ask Bettany to what extent she felt that Renault's Last of the Wine was influencing your own choice of the hemlock cup. as an image for writing about the Athenian democracy?
Well, I'll answer that bit, and I think Paul, who's just written a book on democracy and iterations of democracy, should probably answer the 1950s one. Well, as you say, this is rereading it. I almost realised with horror how deeply she was inside me, and I didn't realise that I'd chosen the Hemlock Cup as a title for my book on Socrates. I think it probably was because of her work. Although I should tell you actually why it happened, and ladies and gentlemen, this shows you the ludicrous nature of publishing, that I was at a book festival in Adelaide, and talking to Mark Haddon, Curious Incident of the Dog, at night time, and I said, I'm writing this book on Socrates and I don't know what to call it, and he said, call it the Hemlock Cup. So that's actually, it's all thanks to Mark Haddon. Paul, what do you think
Well,
about
I've not
Socrates'
anything to add to what's been said. She doesn't strike me as a very political writer or thinker. So she's inevitably influenced by the circumambient world. And she did take part, I believe, in a couple of black sash demonstrations against apartheid. But by and large, her world, she's more interested in the theatre and sex than she is in the assembly and the law courts, which is where Athenian democracy happened.
I mean, I think that Last of the Wine is recognisably a kind of apprentice novel, precisely because it is so full of sources. So she could source almost everything that she wrote. And I think that she gradually realised that actually it's much more fun to have maybe a few sketchy points of Greek source and then to conjure up the fiction, the magic of the novel consists in what exists in between. And I think in that context it's interesting. And I don't know whether this is something that is ever alluded to openly in her books or anything she ever said, but she was taught by Tolkien. And Tolkien, rather similarly, he was using the myths and the epic and the history of are we allowed to call it Dark Ages in Oxford? You know what I mean, early medieval, the early medieval North, in a rather similar way. So that obviously Mary Renault doesn't go to the full Middle Earth, but there is a sense in which her Alexander, as Paul said, she chooses to create Alexander, to evoke him, the period that we know least about him. And as a result, that is what enables him to stand, not just as a figure of history, but as a figure of myth.
And she did actually, of course, write, that was her first novel. She wrote something about the Dark Ages and then destroyed it. I think she described it as knights bashing each other around in Never Never Land.
Yeah.
So that
very Western.
Exactly, clearly not her great. Tonight is a celebration of her and her work. And there was one thing I would just like to thank her for, is that it seems to me that, again, this is with great perspicacity, because this hadn't been recognised when she was writing. You will all know this, that the word man hasn't got anything to do with your gender. It's nothing to do with having a penis and everything to do with having a brain. That the origins of the word are almost certainly to do with mind and thinking. And what it seems to me that she does so brilliantly is both with mankind and with the mind, is not that she de-genders it, but she double-genders it. And that, I think, is something we should all thank her for.
And that, I think that will bring it to conclusion. Thank you so much. What a wonderful note to finish on. Can I, ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, on behalf of St Hughes College and those who've been involved in the organisation of this, express our profound thanks to you, Paul, for your wonderful lecture, and to Bettany and to Tom for the fantastic discussion. Beautifully chaired by and all of you. And also to the Folio Society, who have also supported us with the exhibition here this evening, and to Gordon Wise, and to all of you for coming here to recognise the importance of this woman in literature, to this college, and indeed to wider society in general. I hope you've enjoyed this evening. St Hughes is a buzz. It may be Trinity, it may be exam season, but we don't stop celebrating and having activities. On the 11th of May, Professor Peter Mitchell, Professor of Anthropology, will be giving a lecture on his recently published book, The Horse Nation, which is a look at the impact of the horse on indigenous society since 1492, the 11th of May here in the college. And then for the contrast, just to show we're not all two Ernest in this college. We have pop-up cinema on the lawn, classic films we were looking at. I was distressed to find that Indiana Jones is now considered a classic. To bring the family along to again, and we also have a number of other activities which you'll find on our website. You're all very warmly welcome to return to the college. Thank you all so much. And again, many congratulations to those of our prize winners who are still with us this evening. It's wonderful, and I hope we'll have many, many more students wanting to study classics here in Oxford. Thank you.
Well done.